From New York, this is Democracy Now!
MBS was shocked by all of the anger over the killing of one journalist. According to the Wall Street Journal, on a phone call with Jared Kushner, MBS asked, why the outrage? And frankly, MBS's confusion is completely understandable. He's been getting away with autocratic like this for years with almost no blowback from the international community.
Netflix is under fire for pulling an episode of U.S. comedian Hassan Minhaj's show Patriot Act in Saudi Arabia at the kingdom's request. The show took aim at Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman for the brutal killing and dismemberment of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. We speak with Human Rights Watch and the Committee to Protect Journalists, which ranks Saudi Arabia the third most censored country in the world. Then a remarkable documentary just shortlisted for the Oscars takes us inside the life of Nadia Murad, the Yazidi Kurdish human rights activist from Iraq who was awarded the 2018 Nobel Peace Prize for her heroic activism after escaping sex slavery at the hands of the Islamic State. It's called On Her Shoulders.
Miss Nadia Murad. This is Miss Nadia Murad.
I now give the floor to Miss Nadia Murad Basi Taha.
I beg you to put humans first. This life was not only created for you and your families. We also want life, and it's our right to live it.
We'll speak with the film's director, Alexandria Bombach, who was at the Nobel ceremony. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Democrats will take control over the House of Representatives as new members are sworn in today. Democrats picked up 40 seats in the November election, while in the Senate, Republicans expanded their majority slightly to 53. Over 100 women will serve in the House for the first time in U.S. history, including the first two Native American women, the first two Latino women from Texas, and the first two Muslim women. Palestinian-American Rashida Tlaib of Michigan will be sworn in the Quran that once belonged to Thomas Jefferson. She plans to wear a thobe, a traditional Palestinian gown, to the ceremony. Democratic Socialist Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York is now the youngest woman ever to serve in Congress. One congressional seat that will not be filled today is North Carolina's 9th District. Republican Mark Harris was initially believed to be the winner of that race against Democrat Dan McCready, but the results were not certified amidst allegations of Republican voter fraud. With their new majority, Democrats now have the ability to subpoena the administration and are expected to launch investigations into President Trump and his administration. Meanwhile, some House progressives are objecting to a proposed rule change backed by incoming House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, known as PAYGO, which requires Congress offset any new spending with either tax increases or cuts to other programs. Some lawmakers have called the rule a conservative austerity measure that'll hamper their efforts to pass progressive legislation. Congressman Jim McGovern, the incoming chair of the House Rules Committee, has promised he won't allow PAYGO to derail progressive causes like Medicare for all. The partial government shutdown enters its 13th day as the impasse over Trump's demand for $5 billion in border wall funding shows little signs of progress. Democratic leaders said Wednesday they had a plan for reopening the government while creating a 30-day period for further negotiations on border security. Incoming House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says the plan does not include border wall funding. Trump reportedly told Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer that he would look foolish if he agreed to the deal. This is Speaker Pelosi speaking to reporters in front of the White House yesterday.
Tomorrow we will bring to the floor legislation which will open up government. It will be based on actions taken by the Republican Senate. Bills that have passed on the floor of the Senate by over 90 votes and or in committee unanimously, led by Senator Mitch McConnell. Our question to the president and to the Republicans is, why don't you accept what you have already done to open up government, and that enables us to have 30 days to negotiate for border security.
People have been sharing the effects of the shutdown on their lives using the hashtag #ShutdownStories. Testimonies range from the inability to pay bills, rent, to purchasing essential medicines and even food. Meanwhile, Native American communities are also feeling the effects of the government shutdown, as a disproportionate number rely on federally funded services, including for health care and food. Many Native Americans are also employed by the government. In the southwest United States, some members of the Navajo Nation have been stuck at home, unable to drive to get to groceries and other essentials as roads are not being cleared of snow. Overall, nearly 1 million workers are working without pay or are furloughed. At his first cabinet meeting of 2019, President Trump opined on a myriad of issues ranging from border wall funding to his recently departed Defense Secretary James Mattis. Trump suggested he fired Mattis, even though Mattis publicly announced he was resigning after disagreeing with Trump's foreign policy. Speaking on North Korea, Trump said he received a great letter from Kim Jong-un and looked forward to a follow-up meeting following their historic June summit in Singapore.
Established a very good relationship with North Korea. That was going to be a war. That could have been a World War III, to be honest with you, because that would have, a lot of people would have had to get involved in that all over Asia, and then it spreads beyond Asia. And instead, we have somebody that I really think wants to get onto economic development and making a lot of success and money, frankly, for his country.
Asserted if he were not president, a war would have broken out on the Asian continent. He also expressed confidence North Korea was not testing nuclear weapons. It's unclear whether the Trump administration will agree to lift sanctions as demanded by North Korea before moving forward with negotiations. At the meeting, President Trump also addressed the ongoing trade war with China and the recent stock market turmoil.
The talk of the world. And we had a little glitch in the stock market last month, but it's still up, I guess, around 30% from the time I got elected. And it's going to go up once we settle trade issues. And once a couple of other things happen, it's going to go up. It's got a long way to go, tremendous amount to go. The trade deals we're making are fantastic for our country.
During the meeting, a poster featuring an image of Trump with the Game of Thrones-inspired phrase, "Sanctions are coming November 5th, was on display on the table in front of Trump. Trump initially tweeted the image on November 2nd as harsh economic sanctions against Iran were set to kick in following Trump's withdrawal from the 2015 Iran nuclear agreement. The original phrase from Game of Thrones is "Winter is coming" and references the character of Jon Snow, who in the show led a caravan of refugees through a border wall. In India, 2 women defied a centuries-old religious ban by entering the Sabrimala Hindu temple that had, until recently, been prohibited to women of reproductive age. A Supreme Court ruling in September overturned the ban, but Hindu nationalists, including Prime Minister Narendra Modi's BJP party, had opposed the ruling, and other attempts to enter the temple had been blocked. This is women's rights activist Tripti Desai, who herself was previously blocked from entering the temple.
The entry of women in Sabrimala today is an historic win for us. It is a victory of the movement of equality, and it is a victory of women power because after the verdict of the Supreme Court, the protesters were opposing the entry of women, and today that protest has become unsuccessful as the women have entered there.
The women's successful entry early Wednesday came hours after throngs of women took to the streets in Kerala to form a massive 385-mile human chain protesting gender inequality and in solidarity with women seeking to access the holy site. The action, organized by the leftist government coalition in Kerala, brought out over 1 million people, according to some estimates. In Mali, government officials have deployed armed forces after reporting 37 civilians were killed Tuesday by gunmen in central Mali. The victims of the attack are members of the Fulani community. Violence and tension between nomadic Fulani herders and Dogon farmers had been on the increase, reportedly sparked by land disputes. The Dogon have also accused the Fulani of ties to extremist groups. In Russia, the U.S. ambassador, former Utah Governor John Huntsman, visited a U.S. citizen who's accused by the Russians of espionage charge. Paul Whelan, who was arrested in Russia Friday, is a former Marine who now works for the auto parts supplier Borg-Warner. He was reportedly in Moscow attending a wedding. His family has said he's innocent of the espionage allegations. Some have speculated Whelan's arrest is retaliation for the arrest of the Russian gun rights activist Maria Butina, who in December pleaded guilty to conspiring to act as a Russian agent without registering with the Justice Department. Butina has been jailed since July after being accused of trying to infiltrate the NRA and other right-wing groups in the lead-up to the 2016 election. China's space agency has released a photo from the lunar surface after its Chang'e 4 space probe became the first ever to land on the far side of the moon. The mission could reveal important clues about the formation of both the Earth and its satellite and advances China's goal of landing humans on the moon in the 2020s. In more space news, NASA's New Horizons mission has sent back its first photo from Ultima Thule, the most distant object ever visited by a space probe. The icy asteroid is composed of two spheres smashed together resembling a snowman. It's about 4 billion miles from Earth in a ring of debris known as the Kuiper Belt, left over from the solar system's formation. The National Rifle Association suing the state of Washington after a new law banning the sale of semi-automatic assault rifles to anyone under the age of 21 went into effect January 1st. The law is part of a package of new gun control regulations approved by Washington state residents in November. In media news, longtime NBC reporter and analyst William Arkin has left the network and wrote a scathing memo on his way out. In the memo, Arkin condemns the media's reporting on U.S. wars and says he's not interested in taking part in the Trump circus. He writes, quote, "I find it disheartening that we do not report the failures of the generals and national security leaders. I find it shocking we essentially condone continued American bumbling in the Middle East and now Africa through our ho-hum reporting." Arkin goes on to write about the network's coverage of the Trump administration. Of course, Trump is an ignorant and incompetent imposter, and yet I'm alarmed at how quick NBC is to mechanically argue the contrary, to be in favor of policies that just spell more conflict and more war, Arkin wrote. You can see our past interviews with William Arkin at our website, democracynow.org. And in New York City, 11 activists who are currently fasting to protest the ongoing U.S.-backed Saudi-led war on Yemen were arrested yesterday for blocking the entrances to the U.S. mission to the United Nations. Protesters who were standing quietly with banners were charged with disorderly conduct before being released. They enter their 6th day of fasting today, with planned actions in front of the United Arab Emirates, French and British missions to the UN. On Friday, they'll protest in front of Lockheed Martin's New York City offices. This is Kathy Kelly of Voices for Creative Nonviolence speaking before her arrest yesterday.
We're a group of people with a deep and abiding concern about the United States policies, especially as they enact them in the United Nations, failing to save the lives of 87,500 children who already starved.
See all our interviews with Kathy Kelly, including our November interview about the Saudi and U.S. role in Yemen. Go to our website at democracynow.org. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. Netflix is under fire for pulling an episode of U.S. comedian Hassan Minhaj's show Patriot Act from Saudi Arabia after officials from the kingdom complained to the streaming company that it violated Saudi cybercrime laws. The episode was posted in late October, a few weeks after Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi's murder in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. Hassan Minhaj sharply criticized the Saudi royal family and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman.
Just a few months ago, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, a.k.a. MBS, was hailed as the reformer the Arab world needed. But the revelations about Khashoggi's killing have shattered that image. And it blows my mind that it took the killing of a Washington Post journalist for everyone to go, oh, I guess he's really not a reformer. Meanwhile, every Muslim person you know was like, yeah, no, he's the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. So now would be a good time to reassess our relationship with Saudi Arabia. And I mean that as a Muslim and as an American. MBS was shocked by all of the anger over the killing of one journalist. According to the Wall Street Journal, on a phone call with Jared Kushner, MBS asked, why the outrage? And frankly, MBS's confusion is completely understandable. He's been getting away with autocratic shit like this for years with almost no blowback from the international community.
In the 18-minute episode, Minhaj slams the Saudi regime and the Crown Prince for the kingdom's persecution of women and human rights activists and its ongoing war in Yemen. He also calls out the long-standing relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States and skewers the Western portrayal of the Crown Prince as a modern reformer.
The censored episode has been viewed more than 1.6 million times on YouTube, where it remains available to viewers in Saudi Arabia. On Wednesday, Hassan Minhaj tweeted, clearly the best way to stop people from watching something is to ban it, make it trend online, then leave it up on YouTube. Let's not forget that the world's largest humanitarian crisis is happening in Yemen right now. Please donate to rescue.org/Yemen, he wrote. Democracy Now! Invited Netflix to join us on the show, but it declined our request. A spokesperson said, quote, we strongly support artistic freedom worldwide and remove this episode only in Saudi Arabia after we had received a valid legal demand from the government and to comply with local law, unquote. Well, for more, we're joined by two guests. In Washington, D.C., Courtney Radge is with us, Advocacy Director at the Committee to Protect Journalists. And via Democracy Now! Video stream, we're joined by Sarah Lee Whitson, Executive Director of Human Rights Watch's Middle East and North Africa Division. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Courtney, let's begin with you. Talk about the significance, what you understand at this point, why Netflix pulled this Minhaj episode.
The understanding is they're saying that they were complying with local laws. The laws in Saudi Arabia are extremely repressive. They have a very restrictive cybercrime law that imposes fines of millions of riyals and jail sentences of up to 5 years for contradicting those statutes. And among the statutes of this law include things like publishing material online that contravenes public morals or insults the king, etc. So I think that what we're seeing is Netflix saying that it complies with local laws, but these local laws are completely out of touch with, obviously, with the First Amendment and with the rights of users in one of the world's most censored and restrictive countries to get information. And I think it's relevant and interesting to see that Netflix specifically talked about artistic freedom, which is very important, but this is also about press freedom and the freedom to get information.
So, Sarah Lee Whitson, can you respond to that and the fact that Netflix said that it was complying with local law, and where else you're aware that this happens? I mean, is it very extraordinary that Netflix made this decision in Saudi Arabia?
In terms of other precedents, where we see this most often is with newspapers that have print editions in countries where material is sometimes censored preemptively in compliance with what people believe to be local laws. But in those cases, the newspapers will usually claim that it's the local publisher that's doing the censoring and not themselves. Obviously, we have issues with Google's censoring of search engines in China, and that's something that we have condemned and complained about. But I don't know of another instance, there may well be others, of a broadcaster censoring an episode of a TV show in the country because of a specific request from the country's government. So it does seem like an expansion of the slippery slope of content that's deemed unacceptable. I think this was a big mistake.
Sarah, were you concerned that Netflix actually called it a valid request?
Well, yes. I mean, it starts with the presumption that if there's a local law, regardless of what international laws, human rights laws it violates, regardless of the absurdity of the law on its face, which basically says that facts and news are to be banned if they are hurtful or insulting to the Crown Prince, they're going to comply with that.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion and play some more clips of Hasan Minhaj's comedy routine, which, of course, goes well beyond that very biting commentary about everything from Saudi Arabia to the catastrophe in Yemen, to the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, and to U.S. complicity. Also talks about Jared Kushner. This is Democracy Now! Back in a minute.
Oh, have you ever woke up from a daydream and realized that the world's gone crazy? You people are all the same, going blah, 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 going bang, bang, bang. Oh, I'm a laid-back girl, floating in the sun, looking down at the world. Oh, just sipping is kind of my thing. You do you, I'll do me, chilling at the bottom of the sea. And I say, just be a prom. Oh, just be a prom.
The Prom Song by Superorganism. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
Netflix is garnering widespread criticism for pulling an episode of U.S. comedian Hasan Minhaj's show Patriot Act from Saudi Arabia after officials from the kingdom complained to the streaming company that it violated Saudi cybercrime laws. The censored episode has been viewed more than 1.6 million times on YouTube, where it remains available to viewers in Saudi Arabia. This is a clip from the censored episode of Hasan Minhaj's show Patriot Act.
The conflict in Yemen is extremely complex, but here are the cliff notes in under 40 seconds. Yemen was spiraling into civil war. The Houthi rebels who've been battling against the government for years almost seized power in 2015. But then Saudi Arabia intervened to prop up the Yemeni government. Saudi was like, yo, I got you, boo. Don't worry. But there is something you should know. I think these rebels are getting help from Iran. That's important because Saudi Arabia and Iran hate each other. It's from 1979. So Saudi Arabia started bombing the out of rebel territory, compliments of the West. And now many experts think that Saudi Arabia is using Yemen as a proxy war against Iran to control the region. So take 3 wars, shove them into the Arab world's poorest country, and that's the conflict in Yemen. Now don't clap. That is a global atrocity. It is the worst of everything happening in one place, and people keep wondering, will this ever end?
On Wednesday, Hasan Minhaj tweeted, clearly the best way to stop people from watching something is to ban it, make a trend online, then leave it up on YouTube. Let's not forget the world's largest humanitarian crisis is happening in Yemen right now. Sarah Lee Whitson, can you talk about what's happening in Yemen as we move into this new year? And today, on this day of the new Congress, you've had major attempts in both the Senate and the House to stop the U.S. funding for the Saudi-UAE war on Yemen. Where do you see that going right now?
Sure. With respect to the war in Yemen, there was supposed to be a ceasefire that was negotiated in December and to put in provisions to protect the port of Hodeidah from where Yemen imports the vast majority of its food and its fuel. Unfortunately, the ceasefire has not held and fighting has continued, and the bombardment of Yemen has continued by Saudi coalition forces, which really is primarily Saudi Arabia and the UAE at this point. There continues to be an extreme humanitarian disaster, a catastrophe, a man-made catastrophe in the country, leading to starvation conditions for millions of people. And, of course, over this past year, the U.S. media and the British media in particular have finally focused on the devastation caused by this war. With respect to the U.S. role in this war, the United States continues to provide intelligence and targeting assistance, although this year, under pressure from the American public, from the American Congress, President Trump announced that they would suspend the refueling of Saudi aircraft and Emirati aircraft of their planes, ironically refueling of hundreds of millions of dollars in petrol that the Saudis and Emiratis never paid for. Of course, they claim that Saudi and UAE are now able to refuel their own planes. But in fact, this is widely seen as an effort of President Trump to pull back a tiny bit from this war. The military arms sales, of course, to Saudi and the UAE continue unabated. And I expect that that is where we're going to see the main focus of the new Congress and its congressional efforts starting this month.
And Courtney, can you talk about more broadly censorship in Saudi Arabia and how many journalists and also activists are imprisoned in the kingdom?
Is one of the world's leading jailer of journalists. It's the fourth leading jailer of journalists. And we recorded in our annual census 16 journalists who are behind bars in retaliation for their reporting and because of their reporting. And that's the highest number that we have ever recorded since we began keeping records in 1991. So this really shows the crackdown that has accelerated as Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has attempted to consolidate power. It's also an incredibly censored country. And so what we see is that journalists, activists, and others in the country who wish to share or receive information need to use alternative platforms. So platforms like YouTube, like Netflix. You know, this was a really important episode that laid out in pretty scathing detail some of the issues behind Jamal Khashoggi's violent, brutal murder, really unprecedented murder in a third country by the highest levels of Saudi officialdom. And you know, these people in Saudi Arabia depend on a variety of platforms to get information. And I think that's why it's concerning to see Netflix comply with this request. Because actually, we know that tech companies across the world, U.S.-based tech companies, are complying with these requests to take down specific pieces of content that are newsworthy, that are important, at the direct request of governments. And so this is an expansion now to another platform in a way that we're seeing around the world.
Hassan Minhaj also took on Saudi Arabia targeting women drivers on his censored episode of Patriot Act.
Prisons are filling up in Saudi Arabia. Hundreds are being detained, including critics of MBS and political activists. Some of the most prominent activists are women who protested the driving ban. And MBS had them arrested, and several of them are still in prison today. Even executions are up. The country is on track to execute more than 2,000 people by the year 2030. Now, that's the Vision 2030 nobody's talking about. Strong-arming, coercion, detaining people. These are MBS's go-to moves, and he's been getting away with all of it.
Sarah Lee Whitson, if you can talk about the significance. I mean, you have Mohammed bin Salman, and there was just a shakeup in the government, and his power was even further consolidated. You have Mohammed bin Salman legalizing women drivers and then jailing the women who were the activists for women driving.
Well, I think it's a twofold reflection of who Mohammed bin Salman is. First of all, I think the lifting of the ban on women driving was a very smart move because it reflects a recognition that the vast majority of the Saudi population never supported and don't support the ban on women driving. Over 50% of the population is under the age of 25. Over 75% of the population is under the age of 30. And so clearly in line with the youth bulge of the country, the driving ban had to go. At the same time, it reflects Mohammed bin Salman's desire and wish to consolidate all power in his country and to make it clear to civil society, to the public, that the lifting of the driving ban is not because of their activism, which has been going on for decades, but because he decided it. And jailing the women activists is a very clear signal to the Saudi public not to get any ideas, not to think that just because he lifted this driving ban that it had anything to do with what the Saudi public is demanding, and that he will severely punish the Saudi public who makes any demands on him. So in a sense, he is signaling that he will act with absolute authority as an absolute monarch.
Well, let's go to another clip from the censored episode of Hassan Minhaj's show, Patriot Act, on Silicon Valley's relationship with Saudi Arabia.
Since 2016, MBS has invested almost $11 billion in Silicon Valley, making Saudi Arabia the largest single funding source for U.S. startups. Come on, Silicon Valley. You're supposed to be hippie capitalists. WeWork won't let you expense meat, but you take money from Saudi Arabia? So you're against slaughterhouses unless they're in Yemen?
Hassan Minhaj. Courtney Raj, can you respond to that? You were talking about this earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a really critical point that might be lost among the broader debate about this, one incident because it is so stark after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. But the fact is that we are seeing that tech companies have this very complicated relationship with Saudi Arabia. And in the case of Netflix, it's not clear, how much revenue they receive from Saudi Arabia. What is that financial relationship? They have not responded on the record to those questions. But we know that there are tech companies that have assets, personnel, et cetera, in very repressive countries, which can lead them to comply with, what they might say is a valid local law. But as Sarah noted, it's not valid according to international standards. And we're seeing that this is becoming very complicated because in countries like Saudi Arabia that's highly censored, or Vietnam or Myanmar, where there are other mass atrocities happening with the Rohingya, for example, that these platforms such as Facebook, Google's, YouTube, Twitter are complying with government requests to take down content. Oftentimes that should be protected under international law. Now, at least in the case of the companies that I mentioned and at least 70 other countries, according to Access Now, there are transparency reports so that we can see how many government requests for content removal, for takedowns are there, how many do they comply with, how are they received, are they a valid legal order, or are they just coming through secondary communication channels. And I think that's very important. And I think Netflix needs to consider its role as a platform in which journalistic content, there are many documentaries, news shows like Patriot Act that are serving a newsworthy purpose. And they need to consider doing human rights assessments, producing a transparency report, and starting to track government takedown requests, because it's not clear that they're even doing that to begin with. And I think that, they need to understand their responsibility as a platform in this era.
So, Courtney, interestingly, your organization, Committee to Protect Journalists, was just honored on New Year's Eve. As the ball was dropped, journalists were there in Times Square to welcome 2019, because journalists are under so much attack. How significant is this, the message that Netflix is sending to journalists, to actors, to artists around the world when they pull an episode like this that's critical of a dictatorship?
I think Netflix is sending the absolute wrong signal, which is that we're going to comply with your invalid law, with your law that contravenes international rights, that is, a vague, hard to define law. And it's sending a signal, just weeks after Jamal Khashoggi was murdered, that it is going to comply with censorial requests from Saudi Arabia, which has carried out this, unprecedented murder, and which has, as we've heard, continued this war in Yemen. I think that Netflix's decision to comply with this, and the fact that they did not, come out and report on this themselves. It took a journalist from the Financial Times digging to find out that this had happened and to make it aware. I think that this controversy has highlighted for them the fact that they need to get out ahead of these issues. They need to figure out where do they stand on press freedom, on artistic freedom, on freedom of expression. What are their company principles? What does it mean when they're getting a request from a country where they might not have any actual assets? They might have a service. I mean, what were the risks involved to Netflix for failing to comply with that request? You know, there are requests made by governments all the time to internet platforms that they don't comply with, as you can see in the transparency reporting from these other companies. So what was the decision that made Netflix comply with this and, of course, then amplified this into a major public relations disaster for Netflix? I think they can turn this into an opportunity by exploring how to incorporate assessments, like I said, of human rights, looking at joining initiatives like the Global Network Initiative, which we are a founding member of, and it brings tech companies and civil society groups together to try to get out ahead of these types of issues and understand what is the responsibility of platforms working in repressive countries. So there's a lot on their agenda that they're going to need to follow up on after this decision that they made to censor Patriot Act.
Sarah Lee Whitson, interesting. What isn't talked as much about Mohammed bin Salman and Khashoggi is that, well, this is a U.S. State Department report in 2017 that specifically noted that Khashoggi went into self-exile from his home country, from Saudi Arabia, because in 2016, authorities purportedly banned him from writing, appearing on television, and attending conferences as the result of remarks he made that were interpreted as criticizing the President of the United States, referring to President Trump. I mean, the symbiotic relationship that the Saudi regime has with the Trump government, and of course, it went back in time, too. It went back beyond Obama, including Obama.
Yeah, I mean, it's was very upsetting to the Crown Prince that Jamal Khashoggi was warning Saudis that Trump would not be a reliable friend to the country and that he would be a dangerous leader. And that is what led to the strongest measures against him, banning him from writing and social media. Jamal's decision to leave the country was primarily motivated by his observation that his friends and other journalists, other writers, intellectual leaders, religious leaders were being arrested in front of his eyes. And he saw where the winds were blowing and made the very smart and correct decision to leave the country as a result. But as increasingly we're finding out, the Saudi and Emirati governments were very closely tied to the Trump administration. And I think we'll continue to see more and more information coming out of the Saudi and Emirati efforts to hinge their wagon to candidate Trump well before he was elected, as apparently the Russians were doing.
Well, we'd like to end with a clip from the censored episode of Minaj's show, Patriot Act, on the relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia.
So when you add it all up, it's insane wealth, its place in Islam in the Middle East, it all makes Saudi Arabia a country of huge significance, which is why every single president since FDR has maintained a strategic alliance with Saudi Arabia. Whether it's for oil or arms deals, we have always played it cool with the Saudis no matter what they do. Remember, America hates terrorists. Saudi Arabia gave them passports. Saudi Arabia was basically the boy band manager of 9/11. They didn't write the songs, but they helped get the group together.
Hasan Minhaj in Patriot Act. Netflix pulled it from Saudi Arabia. It continues to be accessible on YouTube and has gotten over 1.6 million hits. This is Democracy Now! We want to thank Courtney Radge, Advocacy Director for Committee to Protect Journalists, and Sarah Lee Whitson, Executive Director of Human Rights Watch's Middle East and North Africa Division. When we come back, we go to a remarkable documentary about a remarkable person, Nadia Murad, the Yazidi Kurdish human rights activist who just was awarded the 2018 Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo. Stay with us. By Whirling Dervishes. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We turn now to a remarkable documentary that profiles the life of Nadia Murad, the Yazidi Kurdish human rights activist from Iraq. She was awarded the 2018 Nobel Peace Prize jointly with Congolese gynecologist Dr. Denis Mukwege. In 2014, Nadia Murad was kidnapped by the Islamic State and repeatedly raped as she was held in captivity for 3 months. Since escaping, she's dedicated her life to drawing international attention to the plight of the Yazidi people. The film is called On Her Shoulders. This is the film's trailer.
They're all getting their strength from you. If you cry, they'll cry too. They're all getting their strength from you.
Catastrophe is unfolding in northern Iraq.
ISIL forces have called for the systematic destruction of Yazidi people, which would constitute genocide.
They killed most of her family and they made her their slave.
She managed to escape, but thousands of women are still being held, which is why Nadia Murad is campaigning to try to get the world to notice and do something.
All of us miss Nadia Murad.
And when you think about the men who raped you, what do you want to happen to them?
Did you try to resist? Could you tell him no?
They killed your mother as well.
What happened to the women? What happened to you?
These kinds of questions are not the ones to ask. The things I want to be asked are, what must be done so Yazidis can have their rights? What must be done so a woman will not be a victim of war? These are the kind of things that I want to be asked more often. Today I'm not only talking on my behalf about what happened to me. Here I am the voice of 3,200 girls, women, and children still in captivity.
Honorable members, the presence in the gallery of Ms. Nadia Murad.
Witnesses, Ms. Nadia Murad.
I now give the floor to Ms. Nadia Murad Basi Taha.
I beg you to put humans first. This life was not only created for you and your families. We also want life, and it's our right to live it.
Although she's the strongest person I've ever seen, I don't know how much more strength she has.
That was the trailer for the film On Her Shoulders. The documentary has been shortlisted for an Oscar for Best Documentary and recently received the Columbia Journalism DuPont Award. We go now to Santa Fe, New Mexico, to speak with the film's award-winning director, Alexandria Bombach. On Her Shoulders premiered at the 2018 Sundance Film Festival, where Alexandria won the Best Director Award for a U.S. documentary. We welcome you to Democracy Now!, Alexandria, as you join us from Santa Fe. Talk about how you came to profile Nadia.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Nadia and I met in the summer of 2016. I was really interested in telling her story because of her unique situation of having to repeat her story over and over again. The production company, Riot, and I partnered that summer, and we followed her for 3 months of her campaign, and that was really during a very hectic and peak time of her campaigning.
And could you explain the title, Alexandria? When did you come up with the title On Her Shoulders, and why?
I think that was a really complex decision because, a lot of people wanted it to be called Nadia, but for me this wasn't a biopic. This was, a section of Nadia's life that was really important, but it also was about reflecting on what this film really means, is that, I want an audience to reflect that this is something that we've put on to Nadia. This is something that's on her shoulders to do, which is really a lot as a survivor of this kind of trauma, to be the face of the Yazidis and be the person who's speaking out and trying to get the world to move. It just seemed more appropriate to really reflect on that and call it On Her Shoulders.
Your film, On Her Shoulders, is also really a film about media criticism. Let's go to a clip where Nadia Murad talks about the media.
Of course, all the media we meet, they want to know what is what. But I've been asked many questions like, how did they rape you? How? This is necessary. Of course it's necessary, but some things have been asked. What do you want to do? Some ask. You have become famous. What does that mean to you? These kinds of questions are not the ones to ask. The things I want to be asked are, what is the fate of those girls? How young are the girls who are going through this pain? What is the situation of the refugees who I visit in the camps? What is the situation of my people in the camps in Kurdistan and Sinjar Mountain? What must be done so Yazidis can have their rights? What must be done so a woman will not be a victim of war? These are the kind of things that I want to be asked more often.
A clip from On Her Shoulders. Alexandria, can you talk, as you followed Nadia through these interviews? I mean, you have this really behind-the-scenes look at how she's, in some senses, interrogated by interviewers and reporters. And if you can talk a little more about what happened to her, for example, the murder of her mother and her family.
Well, this, was the first time I was really getting a behind-the-scenes look at what it's like for a journalist to be interviewing someone of this kind that's been through this kind of trauma. As a storyteller myself, I'm usually the one doing the interviewing, and so I understand my own process and dynamic. But sitting back and kind of being privy to that dynamic, it was really shocking to me to see how often Nadia was asked about her captivity in a way that was really digging for a lot of detail. And I think Nadia understood, and I understood that, there is an importance to really outlining how horrific these events were and that they're still happening, and really trying to get people's attention of how horrifying it all is. But at a certain point, it felt sensational and a little bit more gawking at this trauma. But so for me as a storyteller, I don't think I could have ignored that. But I through this process, really found myself being critical of my own storytelling, and it was a very, a huge experience for me to see this things that she was going through, because it made me reflect on our own responsibility as storytellers and to survivors of trauma.
Well, that's one of the questions that one can't help but think in watching the film, which is, what is our responsibility to survivors? So after having made this film and stayed so close to Nadia for all that time, what's your response to that question?
I think, I really was listening to Nadia, that there needs to be a different line of questioning that's moving things forward rather than just talking about her captivity. There was a lot of pressure put on her to retell and retell and retell. And often I would hear people, saying, I know you've had to tell it 1,000,000 times, and we're so sorry, but tell it again. And I think, throughout the filming, kind of saw Nadia become more disillusioned with what the actual impact of media was. And by the end, you really see her come full circle and have more control over her voice. But, this was in the summer of 2016 that we did the filming, and edited in 2017. The film came out January of this year. So she's been doing this since. And since she won the Nobel Peace Prize, I mean, her life has even gotten more hectic. So this was a small glimpse into just the beginning.
We're going to play her full Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, but I want to just squeeze in another clip from On Her Shoulders.
I never considered this to be a job. I want people to know what I'm doing, but I want them to know it's not a job. I want them to know it's a request for help. When the media came to the camp in Iraqi Kurdistan, I would tell them about our conditions in the camp. I would tell them about ISIS, but it never reached anywhere.
Alexandria, can you set the scene for us? You were in Oslo at the Nobel Peace Prize presentations. Your film was shown there. We're going to end with a big piece of her speech. Lay out for us what it was like.
I mean, it was a very powerful event, obviously. I think the big takeaway for me is that a lot of the film is kind of pointing out how problematic this kind of, the accolades and the pageantry can be. And it's conflicting for Nadia, to be awarded for something that all of us wish had never happened. And so being there in Oslo was really interesting because, it's another accolade, and it's an incredible thing, of course, but I think I really want people to reflect that this is not the answer, that there's still so much work to be done. I don't think it's something where we can pat ourselves on the back and say, okay, we gave her an award. There's so much work to be done, and for the Yazidis specifically. And Nadia reflected on that in her speech, which was so powerful, and I hope people do get to listen to the whole thing, that this was not a time for sympathy, but a time for action.
Well, in December, Nadia Murad received the 2018 Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo, Norway. We'd like to end today's show with Nadia in her own words. This is an excerpt of her Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech.
I hope that today marks the beginning of a new era, when peace is the priority, and the world can collectively begin to define a new roadmap to protect women, children, and minorities from persecution, in particular victims of sexual violence. I lived my childhood as a village girl in Kojo, south of Sinjar region. I did not know anything about the Nobel Peace Prize. I knew nothing about the conflicts and killings that took place in our world every day. I did not know that human beings could perpetrate such hideous crimes against each other. As a young girl, I dreamed of finishing high school. It was my dream to have a beauty parlor in our village and to live near my family in Sinjar. But this dream became a nightmare. Unexpected things happened. Genocide took place. As a consequence, I lost my mother, 6 of my brothers, and my brother's children. Every Yazidi family has a similar story, one more horrible than the other because of this genocide. In the 21st century, in the age of globalization and human rights, more than 6,500 Yazidi children and women became captive and were sold, bought, and sexually and psychologically abused. Despite our daily appeals since 2014, the fate of more than 3,000 children and women in the grip of ISIS is still unknown. Young girls at the prime of life are sold, bought, held captive, and raped every day. It is inconceivable that the conscience of the leaders of 195 countries around the world is not mobilized to liberate these girls. What if they were a commercial deal? An oil field or a shipment of weapons? Most certainly, no efforts would be spared to liberate them. Every day I hear tragic stories. Hundreds of thousands and even millions of children and women around the world are suffering from persecution and violence. Every day I hear the screams of children in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. Every day we see hundreds of women and children in Africa and other countries becoming murder projects, fuel for wars, without anyone moving in to help them or hold to account those who commit these crimes. For almost 4 years, I've been traveling around the world to tell my story and that of my community and other vulnerable communities without having achieved any justice. The perpetrators of sexual violence against Yazidis and other women and girls are yet to be prosecuted for these crimes. If justice is not done, this genocide will be repeated against us and against other vulnerable communities. Justice is the only way to achieve peace and coexistence among the various components of Iraq. If we do not want to repeat cases of rape and captivity against women, we must hold to account those who have used sexual violence as a weapon to commit crimes against women and girls.
أشكركم جدا على شرف هذا التكريم.
Thank you very much for this honor, but the fact remains that the only prize in the world that can restore our dignity is justice and the prosecution of criminals. There is no award. There is no award that can compensate for our people and our loved ones who were killed solely because they were Yazidis. The only prize that will restore a normal life between our people and our friends is justice and protection for the rest of this community.
That was Nadia Murad receiving the 2018 Nobel Peace Prize on International Human Rights Day, December 10th, 2018, just a few weeks ago in Oslo, Norway. I want to thank Alexandra Bombach, the award-winning filmmaker, cinematographer, director of On Her Shoulders, which profiles the life of Nadia Murad. It is playing in select theaters from New York to Los Angeles and also available at, among other places, Amazon Prime. That does it for our show. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warrenoff, Sam Alkoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Masood, Sharina Nadura, Tay-Marie Astudio, and Libby Rainey. Mike DeFilippo and Miguel Noguera are our engineers. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Julie Crosby, Hugh Grant, David Prude, Ariel Boone, Vesta Godars, and Carl Marxer. And to our camera crew, John Randolph, Kieran Meadows, Anna Uzbek, and Matt Ely. You can see and listen to our shows at democracynow.org and video and audio podcast. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.